All right, so today we are working our way through chapter 2 and 3 of the Memler's textbook. So this is actually going to be kind of a double chapter day. The first one, good Lord, there's a bunch of space at the end of my notes. The first one is just going to be a little bit of like chemistry, and then the second sort of half of this PowerPoint is going to be a little bit about like cellular biology, because like we need to understand the small if we are going to have a deeper understanding of the large. That's kind of the concept here, right? If we can understand like what's going on in a cellular level, we can certainly understand what's going on like sort of a biological or an organismic level, right? Of your body, we kind of talked about this yesterday. I pulled up a picture of this actually. You've got all of these, like, if you were to look at like the periodic table of elements, like all those freaking elements that are making up our entire universe, we got about 96 of them, right? But only 26 of them are actually found in living organisms. So of all of those like compounds, right? If you look at the periodic table here, and there's just tons of them on there, right? We've only got about 26 that are actually considered like found in our body. And of that like 26, what's kind of funny is only 4 of them are what we consider to be organic compounds. Now, when you use the word organic, you might be thinking, like, oh, it's a banana that they didn't spray with pesticides, like, oh, it's it's organic food. It's the healthier stuff that I'm supposed to eat so I can avoid all those chemicals, right? Here's the thing, like me personally, and I'm not trying to give any like dietary advice with this sentence or anything, but like I have nothing against like chemicals, like give me all the GMO foods, as long as like they actually are healthy and they haven't been sprayed, certain pesticides and stuff. I don't necessarily mind avoiding those, but even like pesticides haven't been shown to be that harmful to us because we have a really strong immune system for the type of organism we are and stuff. And chemistry has done really amazing things. Yeah, we wouldn't have Honeycrisp apples without GMO foods. Honeycrisps are genetically modified because they just, they bred those specific strains together. I think I think out of everybody here, it would just be Dion and Chris that would know this, but like I'm a big fan of the show Hot Ones. I think I was telling you guys about this before, like the Christmas break. We did we did the Hot Ones challenge where you drink like, you put the wings in the super spicy stuff. We wouldn't have like ghost peppers and all that stuff if it wasn't for GMO foods. Those are all they have to be sort of genetically modified to be created. But when we say organic, what we actually mean in the realm of chemistry is we are talking about the elements that bind really well to carbon. So and carbon itself, right? So you take a look at the periodic table here. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are the 4 elements that make up the most of us, about 96% of our body weight. And most of that is because like hydrogen and oxygen, that's how you get water, right? H2O, right? And so like that obviously makes up a huge part of us, but like another like 4% of our body weight is actually going to be made up of all these like elements that are not necessarily organic. It's like your body is made out of like inorganic rocks and metals. Like if you ever look at let's say molybdenum, right? It actually looks like this. It's a big metal, and that is like part of you. Like you need to have this to make up a part of your body. Very small part of your body. If we look at zinc, same thing. It's kind of a little like metallic rock there. You look at potassium, that one's kind of a duller looking color, but very similar, right? Sulfur is kind of fun. That makes up our body. You're made out of the stuff that makes fireworks have that, kind of smell. It's like makes fireworks go different colors and all that, like that's how they do that. They add a little bit of iron to the sulfur, boom, you get a red firework. You add a little bit of, I think it's zinc, you get a blue firework or a green firework or something. this is now I'm stepping outside of I'm probably way off on that. But like those things make up our body, right? They make up a very small part of our body. But like if you look at calcium, it looks like this. Actually, it's a metal, you know. It's a metallic looking rock there. That's the calcium that's making up your skeletal system. But it's not just calcium all by itself. It's calcium added with phosphorus. So we look at phosphorus by itself. That also is responsible. You know, this is what they use. Have you ever had one of those like flint and tinders? You know, where you're trying to start a fire by like smashing it? That's there's phosphorus there, I believe, and phosphorus and magnesium, I think, are the two ones that they use. But there's another one that's like very kind of explosive and stuff. But if you put calcium and phosphorus together, you end up with what's called calcium phosphate, which is so cool because now they don't look like freaking metals anymore. Now they look like this. Looks like a freaking bone, you know, and that is actually what most of your bones are made out of, right? They're made out of calcium phosphate and some proteins and all kinds of other stuff. So we've got all these inorganic elements making up our body. We need to make sure that they are like working chemically in such a way that they sort of lend to us having like a full healthy life, right? So again, most of us, we're mostly oxygen, and a lot of us are carbon. Carbon is what gives those four key elements the skeleton that they need to have like a really cool shape, right? And that shape is like something that we can actually use. So for instance, like carbohydrates, right? They're going to be made up of a little bit of carbon, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of hydrogen, and a little bit of nitrogen. So all the carbohydrates that you're consuming have those same four ingredients in them in various different shapes. Protein, well, did I just say nitrogen for the carbohydrates? I meant to do proteins first. Hold on. Sorry. Carbohydrates are just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You know, they're very good for giving us energy, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Those are the three for carbohydrates. Those are actually the same three ingredients that are in fats as well: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Protein is unique. Protein is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, plus nitrogen. And nitrogen is what allows proteins to have all their very unique shapes, which is what I meant to start by saying. So proteins are sort of all four of these, but then the other ones are here. Vitamins actually have the same kind of shape as proteins, very similar, you know, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then a little bit of nitrogen to give them unique shapes, but they're so small that they don't really have any energy for us to unlock or anything like that, which is why vitamins don't have any calories. So when we're talking about chemistry, organic chemistry, really we're spending all of our time talking about the types of things that are sort of working within like carbon, right? So like organic compounds are chemical compounds that come together to make up living things. So obviously there's lots of chemistry out there, you know. Let's see if we can find the chemistry of a firework, you know. Yeah, it's gonna be what elements? Let's look that up. Aluminum sometimes. Interesting, that gives like the silver and white sparky flames. Antimony creates some other ones. So yeah, so we know what, you know, we know what ingredients we need to, you know, get a little bit in there. Calcium. Oh, calcium apparently makes orange colors. That's kind of cool. I didn't know that. Chlorine, iron is definitely got to get red, right? Oh, yeah. So, and then phosphorus, right? So all of those things are going to be, you know, cool for making fireworks, but like, that's not what we're making. We're making, you know, people. So we're going to spend our time, talking mostly about the organic compounds, right? These are compounds that are primarily built on carbon because carbon is really good at making these big, long, complex molecules. Carbon is sort of like the Labrador of the periodic table. And what I mean by that is like, you know, like the difference between cats and dogs, like, you know, like cats are very standoffish. You know, I love cats, but like they choose to like you, you know, like you're not going to be friends with every cat that you come across. But like Labradors, their natural default setting is to like everyone, right? That's kind of how carbon is. Carbon is very willing to sort of bind itself to all of these other elements. And so it makes up the sort of skeleton that we build all of the compounds in our body on. And that's why it's so important. Whenever you hear, like, whenever you're watching a sci-fi movie and they say, like, we found more carbon-based life forms, what they mean is they found an animal that basically has the same ingredients in it as us, right? So we went to Mars and found some like weird little like insect that's been living out there for centuries and somehow still surviving, and they were like, it's carbon-based life, right? We'd be like, yeah, great, that's awesome. Like that means that it could probably live on our planet too, because we're probably very similar, and so that's something that we share with every animal out there. So when it comes to the organic compounds, like I said, there's going to be three main types. We're going to have our carbohydrates, right? Carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, carbohydrates are really cool because they're going to form themselves. We're going to call them sugars, right? So when I said that they can make these big, long, complicated links, what I mean is like they can link a bunch of individual little sugars together. So if you break a carbohydrate down into its building blocks, eventually it will look like this. It'll look like straight up glucose, okay? So this is a molecule of glucose right here, right? And what's really cool about glucose is, and there's the carbon skeleton I was talking about, right? But there's a little bit of carbon, right? Hydrogen, oxygen, right? All those three ingredients we were talking about. And you can put these in these big, long, complicated chains. And when you do, you end up with like a complex carb, right? Complex carbs are literally chemically complex. And we just got done talking about this in nutrition, right? So when you take like a single glucose molecule, single sugar molecule, we're going to call that a monosaccharide, right? Glucose is a single sugar. It's a monosaccharide. When you put a huge chain of those things together, you end up with a complex carb, right? And that's what we're going to call like a polysaccharide. This is a lot of sugar molecules all linked together. So you see, complex carbs are very complex. They make up these, very cool tasting foods that are packed full of energy. And what's great about that is it takes a lot longer. What is this grumpy potato here? It takes, oh, it's a complex carb. He's thinking about the complex things of life. It's so stupid, but I love it. So like what's great about that is like it takes our digestive system time to break down. The really cool thing about like complex carbs, right? Starches, fibers, and things like that, they are so complex that it takes a lot of time for us to sort of deassemble them, and so imagine you work at the Lego store or something like that, and it's like, hey, we don't need, Iron Man is out. He's not popular anymore. We're going to switch him for a Spider-Man Lego. We're going to have to tear all these apart, and you just have to, it's going to take you a while to break every single one of those blocks down, right? It's a very complex thing, right? That's sort of how complex carbs are. So, glycogen found in your body is a complex carb. Starches found in foods are complex carbs. That's one of the really cool things about our body, right? Like we can store complex carbs in our muscles and in our liver. So when you eat like an excessive amount of carbohydrates, your body goes, great, that's awesome. I'll hold on to this, because carbohydrates are our body's favorite source of energy, right? That's the one our body prefers to use. So our body goes, that's excellent, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that carbohydrate and I'm going to rechain it together and put it inside the body, right? And now let's go back to our lesson yesterday and talk about the idea of homeostasis and negative feedback, right? Your body's always trying to maintain homeostasis by like keeping things in a neutral position. Things get too high, your body will lower it down. Things get too low, your body will raise it up, right? So let's say you eat a massive amount of carbohydrates, well, your blood sugar levels are going to go up, right? And so your body is going to use insulin to negative feedback that blood sugar level back to neutral. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to make sure that we are thinking about what types of carbs we are putting into our body. There are complex carbs and there's simple carbs, right? Complex carbs, they take a really long time to break down. They're very complex, And so because of that, if you were to eat a whole bunch of complex carbohydrates, right? I'm actually not going to, we're going to do this. I don't like you saying good or bad. There we go. That one's high res. So let's take a look at the different types of carbohydrates here, right? You take a look at like this white bread right here, right? So white bread has been very processed. This has definitely been like broken down, which tastes a little bit sweeter, right? Like when you put it on your mouth, you're like, oh, that tastes better, And so like this is a piece of like white bread that's going to be very simple compared with like a piece of rye or whole wheat, or something like that, which is much, much, much more complicated, right? So that complicated bread is going to take much longer to break down than the simple stuff, which means when it goes into your body, right? If your body has to take time and energy to like actually break it down, then it's not going to spike your blood sugar levels. It's going to raise your blood sugar levels, but it's going to raise it up slowly. This is why we like complex carbs more than we like simple carbohydrates in regards to health. Because like when you bring in like a very simple carbohydrate, like a piece of white bread, it's packed full. It's got tons of grams of carbohydrates in it, but it's also already so broken down and so simple that it spikes your blood sugar levels. And then your body goes, oh no, I'm totally behind on pulling this sugar out of the blood, and so what it does is it panics and makes a crap ton of insulin. And then all that insulin drives all of the sugar out of your blood because you made so much of it, oftentimes a little bit more than we need. So then your blood sugar levels drop below normal ranges and your body goes, oh no, now I'm really hungry. So what it does, it triggers like hunger hormones. And then all of a sudden you bring in a whole bunch of and you just have a really hard time like balancing out your blood sugar levels. This is what often happens with clients who are like diabetic, right? And this is why we recommend complex carbs, because you could get the same amount of grams of carbohydrates from two different foods. But if one of them is broken down already, like let's say you bring in like 40 grams of just straight up like table sugar, right? Don't do that. But, like 40 grams worth of carbohydrates, just eating like pure teaspoons of sugar, right? Versus like 40 grams from like let's say like a russet potato with the skin on and stuff, right? They're both going to have 40 grams of carbohydrates. Like they're identical in that way. But the difference is the sugar is going to enter your bloodstream practically instantly because it's very, 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 very simple. Whereas like the potato is going to your body's going to have to take time to break it down. So only little bits of sugar are going to enter your blood at a time because like it has to finish breaking this down. Okay, now you can go in, you got to break this down. Okay, now we can go in, right? It raises it much, much, much more slowly. And for the record, there are also like, there's disaccharides in the middle. I know I didn't talk about these in length, but like disaccharides, you can see here, this is things like, so these are all the monosaccharides, right? All the single sugar molecules. There's glucose, that's the one we most often talk about. Fructose is the one found in fruits, by the way. But then here's your disaccharides. So like this is table sugar right here, which is a little bit of it's this little bit of single sugar and this little bit of single sugar put together, which is why it tastes so freaking sweet. It's two, single sugars put together that can break apart very, very easily. Maltose and lactose, those are the ones that are found in milk. Not everybody can break down lactose. We do know that there are some people most people are lactose intolerant. If that's the case, it just means that like, see this little bond right here? See how it's kind of a little bit more complicated than like these two. That takes a special enzyme to be able to break that bond, and not everybody produces that enzyme, and that's where lactose intolerance comes from. And by the way, I always bring this up, but that is natural default human. We are not supposed to be lactose tolerant. It's just that some people mutated a little bit, and now they can break it down. And then here's our complex carbs, right? Plants, starches, yeast. This is kind of fun. Actually, bugs, their outer exoskeleton is actually known as chitin. It's actually a carbohydrate. Fun fact, it's actually a fiber. But yeah, plants and things like that, right? So those are the different types of carbohydrates. So you can see, right, here's a single sugar molecule, here's a double sugar molecule, and then here's a molecule of a complex carb. Look at all of those little molecules all tied together, right? This is going to take a lot longer to break down than just a bunch of this already stacked together. You know, they're sitting near each other, but they don't have to be broken down chemically. That's why this spikes our blood sugar. And this is where we started getting the term good versus bad carbs, you know. Sugars, guys, they do have like a lot of negative side effects because of how they spike our blood sugar levels. Like the chemistry in our body does not respond very well when we flood it with straight up sugars. Doesn't mean that carbohydrates are bad for us. Carbohydrates are a really good source of vitamins and minerals. They're an excellent source of fiber, which is very important. Fiber is basically a super complex carb. In fact, it's so complicated that we can't even break it down. Like we can break down complex carbs, but ultra complex carbs, we just don't have the stomach acid necessary to break it apart. We don't have the enzymes necessary to sort of split it. So it ends up just staying the way it is, moving through your entire body and cleaning you out, right? It cleanses out your small and your large intestine because it doesn't get broken down. And it feeds your gut bacteria, and your gut bacteria are these fun little critters that poop out these fatty acid chains that are very, very good for your heart. And that stuff does go in to your bloodstream. So I'm a huge proponent of getting enough fiber in your diet. So yeah, so that is sort of like the simple chemistry approach to carbohydrates. And I know we just spent a bunch of time talking about that in our nutrition and weight loss classes for some of you guys, but hopefully that felt a little bit like routine at this point. And you're like, yeah, I know exactly what he's going to say here about complex carbs, you know? But any questions, comments, or concerns so far? How are we feeling, everybody? Feeling good? Love it. What's that, Cyrus? Oh, okay. Speaking of simple carbs, there's definitely, I definitely take my morning coffee with sugar. That's the problem with simple carbs. They taste way better. You know, that's where we really start to run into problems. So next organic compound we're going to talk about are fats. So fats are kind of fun, actually. They're the same ingredients as carbohydrates. How weird is that? Like the same three things that make up carbohydrates are the same three things that make up fats. They're just in a very different shape. So these are compounds made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but instead of making little rings like we saw in glucose, you know, rather than making like little rings like this, fats are going to make these big long chains, right? So let's take a look at like a saturated fatty acid, right? If you take a look at like a saturated fat, it is going to look, I'm actually getting pictures of saturated. There we go. I just want the saturated by itself for right now. It looks like this. It's the same thing, but instead of being in like a ring, it's just like a big long tail, right? And so this is a little bit of like hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And it's like a little table of carbon with little hydrogen seats, you know? Now, this is what's known as you know, a lipid, right? So lipids are the various types of fats that you're going to find inside the body, right? And again, lipids, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. This one in particular is a saturated fatty acid. So that's going to be the one that you find mostly in like animal proteins and things like that. But they're going to form themselves in three different shapes, right? We're going to see what are known as triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Let's see if I can find an image with all of these together. Oh, come on, internet. There we go. So if you take a look right here, you can actually see this is what a triglyceride looks like on like a chemical level, right? So there's just like this little backbone right here, And then there's this like little fatty acid attached to it. Now, if that fatty acid is saturated, well, we would call this triglyceride. We call that a saturated fat. If it was unsaturated, we would call it an unsaturated fat. So there's a couple different types of fatty acids out there whenever we're talking about triglycerides. Triglycerides are mainly the fatty acids that we are talking about when we're talking about fats, but there are plenty of other ones that we're getting as well. There's sterols or steroids in the forms of like cholesterols and stuff. There are phospholipids. Phospholipids are really cool. If you look at a phosphate, that's this one right here, right? So instead of having like 3 fatty acids attached to it, if you only have 2 fatty acids attached to it, it has like this little circular head at the top rather than sort of a straight head like this. And what's really cool about that is, and this is true of all fats, but that makes this type of fat very water resilient on one end and very water, oh God, I can't think of a word properly. Resilient on one end and water friendly on the other. Those are not synonyms, but but like what you have is you have this head here. This is what's known as the hydrophilic head. It really likes water, and the hydrophobic end does not. So when you put like oil in water, when you put like oil in water, you'll notice it always does the same thing. It makes those like big globules, right? It makes those like big, kind of, they look like bubbles almost, right? Like this, right? Oh my God, I just saw, so you guys know, I'm actually going to show a crash course video here in a little bit, but I love crash course videos. So I follow Hank on Instagram, and he just posted this yesterday. It stressed me out so much. It was like a reply to this girl. Watch this video real quick. This is kind of horrifying.
Learn a thing or two. First of all, what's happened here?
So this person wanted to like use some leftover wax. So she put like a paper towel in like the remainder of a candle and then just like roasting a marshmallow. Here's the real problem. Like it starts to get out of control because of surface area problems. And
here is we put wax into a bowl with like a paper towel to act as a wick, so that the wick can be massive, which is going to allow for way more fire, which is going to explode your little Tupperware there. Also, the fire is going to be so big you can't blow it out. And then you're going to grab a bottle of water. Never put water on a grease fire.
So how much worse that got, right? So the reason that got so much worse is because like, yeah, like the flames that are, this part of the flame up here, as water's hitting that, it will extinguish some of it. Yes, absolutely, right? But the problem is the water is going to keep moving and then it hits the oil, splashes it everywhere because it doesn't actually move through the oil, because oil does this when it's in water, right? It, oh God, that video stressed me out so much. Like the girl, I hope that person didn't burn her house down. But oil does this. Now what's happening here is the hydrophobic ends are facing inwards, right? So if I had like 2 fat molecules side by side, and let's say the fingers, I guess it'd be a triglyceride, right? It would kind of look like this, right? The little fingers. What would happen is they would face themselves inward, and then the hydrophilic ends that like water would be on the outside. So the phobic ends face inward so that water can't touch them, and the philic ends actually like allow water. So that's one of the things. That's what we use to make up our cell walls, right? We call this, and we're going to see this later today. We call this our phospholipid, because it's a phospholipid, bilayer, because it's 2 layers. So you can see here, this little fatty acid put both of its tails towards the inside. This fatty acid put both of its tails towards the inside. That is what your cells use to make up their walls. So now you can understand why most personal trainers do not recommend low-fat diets, right? We need fat in our diet in order to make up our cell walls. Like this is part of our diet here. This is what gives us this structure. So it can keep water out on both sides. And that's really important because like your cells, want to be able to choose what materials come in and what materials go out. If it didn't have like this sort of protective layer, you're filled with water, right? So then materials would just move in and out of your cells. They wouldn't be able to store things on one end or another. Now, obviously, like I said, we do need to be able to let things into our cells. Well, that's where if you look at your cell wall, it's got these special little channels here, right? These little like kind of interesting shaped things that straddle the wall. These are proteins, actually. Your body will assemble these little proteins that allows like things like carbohydrates to kind of get into the actual cell itself to produce energy, maybe a vitamin or a mineral, or maybe just more protein, right? Protein's going to pass through this protein, like amino acids, and then that way your body can assemble them and make a new channel or something like that. So that is actually what makes up our cell wall. So we really like having phospholipids in our diet, and you're going to get them, and your body can make them by breaking down and adjusting like different triglycerides. So a triglyceride is a triple chain, right? A diglyceride is known as a phospholipid. And then we got monoglycerides, which are things like steroids, which are really just the chain, right? They're kind of just the big, long sort of rope there, right? So there we go, right? There's our steroids, right? There's our phospholipids, and there's our triglycerides. This is actually the picture I was looking for initially. So those are sort of what we talk about. Now, in the diet, we're mostly going to spend our time, there's these, right? And then in our diet, most of our time is going to be spent talking about our different fatty acids, right? So we're going to spend most of our time talking about triglycerides. Triglycerides, a lot of times they get kind of a bad rap. They're often associated with like high cholesterol, and like your doctor will test your cholesterol levels, and they'll test your triglyceride levels. And the reason why is because when you look at like cholesterols, they do look very different. Like a cholesterol is a single little like fat. And when you get enough of those single little fats together, they make up these kind of cool little, like they're little circles, they look like little balls, right? And some of them have lots of protein in them, but others don't. Others are just lots of fat. And that's where we get like our good cholesterol and our bad cholesterol. Now, for the record, both of these cholesterol types do have like roles inside of our body. So they're actually both good cholesterol. But we started calling it bad cholesterol because it gets stuck in our blood vessels, right? It's not very dense. So what'll happen is when we have way too much of it, it starts to build up on the walls of our arteries and veins and things like that. It starts to cause like a lot of problems. So it's bad because we eat way too much of it. It's too much of a good thing. To be fair, bad cholesterol, the low density stuff, it has a job inside the body. It's just that we live in a world where we get way, 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 way too much of it in our diet. And eventually it starts to cause problems, So just to show you the difference between what these actually look like. I don't know why I can never find the difference in like their makeup. It's so funny. I'm always looking for this one picture and I always have trouble finding it. There we go. So if you look at the difference here, right? Here's the good stuff over here. See this like big, long, like blue strand, right? That is actually protein, whereas all of this is mostly like lipids, right? So, and if we look at like the difference between like oil and water again, we always see it. One of the other reasons why, like, the oil, the reason the oil makes these big globules is because of what I said, right? The hydrophobic ends go in, the hydrophilic ends go out. But then we got a different thing to look at here. We also notice that the oil also raises to the top. That's because it's not as dense as water. And so because it's not as dense, it's much more buoyant. This, would have a different density than this. Well, in your blood, that same thing is happening. The LDL stuff, what LDL stands for is it's low density lipoproteins. So it doesn't move through the water as well because it's not as dense. Whereas HDL stands for high density lipoproteins. They both have protein in them, but this stuff is way less dense than this stuff, right? So HDL is going through and it's cleaning out your blood vessels. Your good cholesterol, it's going in and it's like scrubbing the walls, you know, which is great. But the LDL, which generally we get way more of, is going in there and sometimes it starts to build up, right? It starts to actually like build up kind of like this. And then this one attaches to that one and that one attaches to that one because fats really are very attracted to one another. And so then this starts to like narrow the vessel. And that's where we start to end up with like high blood pressure problems and, you know, all kinds of issues associated with our cholesterol. So where the heck do you get the HDL and where do you get the LDL? Well, both of them are going to be found, you know, in your diet whenever you're consuming triglycerides. So whenever you get fat coming in from a food, you're going to be getting some of those different cholesterol types. And generally, the LDL, bad cholesterol, the bad stuff, is usually associated with what we call saturated fats. It's the one I pulled up a picture of a minute ago, right? Saturated fat is like a carbon table where all the seats are filled. These are the ones where we're generally getting our low density our low density lipoproteins, our LDL bad cholesterol, right? That's also like I said, they like to build up on the on the inside of your walls, right? Well, that's also where you can even spot it visually just looking at different types of fats. You know, if you look at like the various types of fats that are out there, right? Let's take a look. Give me a picture. Let's oh nope, that's perfect. Oh, that's even better. All right, let's take a look right here, right? We got, you know, obviously there's a lot of fat in eggs, right? I don't know what that is. It's probably like mayonnaise. Maybe this is ice cream. I know this is olive oil. That one's this is the, but look at over here, right? Look at this meat, right? That's got this like big fatty ring, which means, you know, that probably tastes really good. Yeah, like so like that like little bit of fat that's right there, right? That is solid at room temperature. Look at the stick of butter, right? Let's say that this stuff's been sitting out here for 20 minutes to an hour, right? Like this is still going to maintain its solid shape. This is still going to maintain its solid shape. Like that is a saturated fat. And the reason why it can be a solid is because like it's these big, long, straight chains, you know? So, you know, if you took like the difference between like, you know, say you take spaghetti, right? Spaghetti is just big, long strains, right? So you can take all of it and kind of grip it up and like wrap it together. And now it's kind of like one of those drumsticks. What do they call it? It's like a cinnamon stick. Is that what they call them? That's like the nickname for them, the wooden drumsticks. Well, I mean, they're all wooden, but like where it's a bunch of reeds tied together. I don't know anything about music, but so like, you know, you would have like this thing of pasta, like it'd be very solid. There's really no holes in it. That's kind of what a saturated fatty acid looks like, right? It's a very well packed thing of fat. That is usually where we get our LDL cholesterols. So it's solid in two very different ways. That's why it kind of builds up on our blood vessels. Now, and generally we associate that as being like a bad fat, right? We would say like this is a bad fat because it has lots of cholesterol in it and it's a lot of solid fats, right? But then we look over here, we look at like, you know, and the avocado is going to have saturated fat in it for sure. But it's also very oily, right? It's like it's a nut, you know, at the end of the day. And so the oil that's going to be found in there, the oil here in the like olive oil and stuff, right? Even inside the eggs, right? There's a lot of like fats in there, but they're all very liquid, right? They don't just get to be a solid at, you know, room temperature. You got to like heat them up like crazy to turn those into solids, right? So that unsaturated stuff, the reason it's a liquid is because you can see not every seat at the table is filled. There's actually this little double bond right here, which leaves a couple empty chairs, right? And then this one, and that's just one little, you know, break there. But this one over here is also a liquid. It's got, you know, we can see 3 breaks there. So that's the difference between like what we call a saturated fat, which is the big straight line, and the unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats have these little like gaps in the table, and so it forms this little kink, right? So you can see there, that's one kink, right? But you can also have multiple kinks, right? So if it's got one kink, we would call that a mono for one, unsaturated fat. And if it's got multiple kinks, we would call that a poly for many, unsaturated fat. And that is usually associated with our good cholesterols. So you can see the saturated fats are things like milk, cheese, meats, like dairy products, meats, and mostly animal products, honestly, is a good way to break it down. And then unsaturated fats are usually like oils, eggs, fish, which is still an animal product, but like packed full of really healthy fats, avocados, nuts, seeds, things like that. So unsaturated fat, when you think of like you've probably heard this before. I know I got a couple people who work in like the medical industry. Dion, I'm sure you've heard this before at some point. They'll say like a really good heart healthy diet is like the Mediterranean, which I can't spell, Mediterranean diet, right? And the reason they say that the Mediterranean diet is so good for people is if you look at it, it is a diet that is very rich. Well, this is not just the diet stuff, but it's very rich in like vegetables, oils, fish is a huge part of their diet. There we go. There's like a Mediterranean meal plan there. This is a very heart healthy diet. They do get some wine and stuff, but oh, what am I? No, that's no. Just show me some example foods. You see like it's a lot of like fish, it's a lot of greens and a lot of like colors and stuff, right? So when they're getting like lots of fat in their diet, they're mostly getting unsaturated healthy fats, right? And they get plenty of grains in there too, but they're all very like complicated, carbohydrates, and that's very, very healthy, right? And there's our fatty acids I was talking about. There's the triglyceride, the 3, tri for 3. There's a diglyceride that's a phospholipid, di for 2, and then there's a monoglyceride, which is like a little single fat. Any questions on fats, guys? Still feeling good? All righty. So next one we've got are proteins. Proteins are everybody's favorite, right? We love talking about proteins, and proteins are honestly they're the coolest because they can form themselves in a bajillion different shapes. Proteins are so cool. Everything in your body is made up of like little tiny proteins. That's not what I meant when I said examples of proteins. I just want a really cool list of all kinds of different proteins so I can show them. There's a lot of different, shapes that they can make themselves in. This is always kind of fun. I love drawing proteins because I'm terrible at drawing, but like this is kind of how you draw a protein because on a chemical structure, they just look like this. They're just squiggles, like you want me to draw a protein? There we go. I drew a protein. It's the one thing that I can draw well, because they're these really big, complicated structures that kind of fold themselves. Thanks to nitrogen, they can fold themselves in all these different shapes and stuff. So when you look at it, you'll have like all these really cool structures. They start off as like kind of a big long chain, and then they fold themselves into whatever shape they need to be in. And based on that, that's where your DNA comes in. Your DNA says, hey, this is the shape we want you in. And so that's how we make a muscle cell, or maybe that's how we make an enzyme. Maybe it's how we make a little bit more DNA. DNA can make other DNA. Proteins are amazing. They can make all kinds of different stuff. Sorry, I haven't seen a chemistry. Oh, that's a dirty joke. So proteins are really cool. They are a little bit of carbon, a little bit of hydrogen, and a little bit of oxygen. Same 3 ingredients there, but they got that nitrogen, which gives them a unique shape. Now, what's really cool about that unique shape, right, is the building blocks of proteins are what we call amino acids, right? So here's what an amino acid looks like, okay? And I'm just going to go ahead and sort of mess with this here. Let's go over to Paint. Take that, put it here. So here is a general amino acid, right? Now I'm going to remove this really quick. We're just going to put this over here so we forget about it. So take a look at your amino acid here. It's made out of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, right? Same exact thing. But there's also this little bit of nitrogen here. That is what starts to give it a unique shape. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, if N stands for nitrogen and C stands for carbon and O stands for oxygen and H stands for hydrogen, what the heck does the R stand for? Well, here's the thing. There is not an R on the periodic table. Right? What is this? I guess rhenium. Yeah, okay, that's okay. Is rhenium R? I don't think it is. See, we get out of the organic stuff, and I do not know my chemistry that well. Yeah, rhenium is Re. So there is no R. There's no R on the periodic table. So what the heck could it be, right? Well, this is actually what we call an R group. Meaning if you were to zoom in on this R right here, this is sort of a fill in the blank example, right? This is kind of represents, it's like algebra. It's X, you know? And so this little side chain right here, it can look 20 different ways. Okay, so if we look at the various amino acids, there's going to be 20 of them, and they're all going to have slightly different shapes in their little R group. Okay, so their R group or their little side chain looks a little bit different, right? Like, oh, there we go. If we look at this, right? COO, like this is all the same, right? But then there's just a little bit of R group here, and you zoom in on it and look at how they all look different, right? CH3, CH, right? This is alanine, this is valine, leucine, isoleucine, phenylalanine, proline. All of them look totally different. A lot of leans in the amino acids, which makes sense because you're building muscle. It's my favorite dumb joke. But there's a lot of leans and proteins. But you see, they all look very different from one another. So there's going to be 20 of those. Okay, there's going to be 20 different amino acids, and they're all going to be different from one another because this little R group here, there's 20 variations of what is going to be inside this R. So now, when we actually look at like kind of a protein, right? And here they all are. Here's your amino acids. That's the list of 20. You guys do not need to memorize this. You know, my nutrition folks, we've already said that, but like I've seen people try to memorize their amino acids. I will say, if you want to memorize a few amino acids and get familiar with them, you can get familiar with what are your branched chain amino acids. That's going to be leucine, isoleucine, and valine. You want to get familiar with those? Great, because like they have been sort of associated with making it a little bit easier to build muscle. I will say though, the research on that has been limited. It does not mean you need it as a supplement. These are a very popular like weightlifting supplement. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that in people who have like a well-rounded, healthy diet, it helps at all. Because what ends up happening is your body's like, we already got these from regular protein. We got that from the chicken breast you ate earlier, you know? So like when you give it more, it doesn't do anything. That being said, if you took somebody who is on like a really low calorie diet, or, you know, you took somebody who maybe like a vegan who doesn't get a very well-rounded amino acid group, or if you don't get you know, a variety of proteins in your diet, then yeah, they might be actually pretty good. And that's where, if you look at the studies that they've done, they're like, see, it helped people build muscle. Every one of those people were like untrained individuals who probably weren't exactly watching what they eat. So the science is out on that one. But if you do want to get familiar with them, you know, those are the 3 essential amino acids that are very important for muscle building. So, but don't memorize all 20. It really is like a waste of time. But of the amino acids, they've got these really cool shapes, right? There's 20 of them. And so when they form themselves in a shape, they can make all of these really cool proteins inside of our body. So a protein is a chain of amino acids, right? And depending on what order those amino acids are in, determines the protein. So if I just took these 4 right here, and I just flipped them around a little bit, I put cysteine at the beginning and I took leucine and put it at the end, and phenylalanine goes in the middle, right? If I just change that, you know what that means? That means that this is no longer maybe a protein of skin. Maybe now it's a protein of muscle, or maybe I turned it into an enzyme or DNA, or maybe one of those little channels we saw on our cell earlier. So all the proteins in your body are these big complex chains of these amino acids. And what determines which protein it is the shape of, is the order of those amino acids. Now, how does your body know what order to put them in when it's making skin or, hair, nails, muscle, DNA, enzymes, whatever? How does it know how to make which protein? Well, that's where your DNA comes in. So like, for instance, I should bring my roommate in here because he's even paler than I am. But like the example I always use, because it's just very easy to visualize, fun fact, everybody in this call right now, we've all got like blue eyes, right? Down below, right? But if you produce like a lot of melanin in your DNA, right? Which, as like the palest person in the, in the freaking world, because I'm from Oregon. I grew up like with no sun. Cyrus, you were asking earlier, right? Yeah, I grew up in the Northwest. There's no sun up there. That is where like there's just not a lot of like melanin production, right? So it leads to like a lack of color. Whereas like, if you've got like brown eyes or green eyes, like some other color, that is coming from more melanin being produced in that protein, right? So that's the shape of that protein. It's just a slightly different shape. At default, like if you have a lack of this protein, this is sort of what color everything looks like. And that's where if you actually look at like, let's see if we can see like, if you look really up close, you'll often see in the background a little bit of like blue around like the rings there sometimes. That's where like you get people with like heterochromia. You ever see that, guys? Heterochromia is so cool looking. It's where you get like the multicolor, right? And so like this is like they're almost, oh, look at that one. That's so cool, right? I definitely want to get like I'd love to get like you see them a lot in Australian shepherds. They often have like heterochromia. And so what this is like, whoop, that's very zoomed in. A little bit of protein over here, and then this one's missing protein, right? So just not producing it as much. And that's all the various different shapes. There's so many different like proteins out there. It's the coolest freaking thing. But I love like, this is like my favorite example. Oh, that's so funny. Look at that. They both, that's awesome. That is like a really like kind of fun thing to actually see. And so it's just a very visual example of like proteins and stuff. Now, there are definitely lots of other proteins in your body, right? Remember earlier we were talking about enzymes, right? So enzymes, very important for metabolism because enzymes actually kick off some of this chemistry that we've been talking about. You take a bunch of like stuff, put it near each other. It might not actually chemically bond or do anything, but you squirt a little enzyme in there and then the action starts to kick in. So enzymes are a type of protein that your body makes, and it kicks off metabolic reactions. It works, we call it a lock and key mechanism, which is why my favorite analogy to describe enzymes is it's kind of like the key to your car, right? Like the key to your car is what starts your car, but it doesn't have any gasoline, right? It doesn't have any energy. Well, that's kind of how an enzyme is. Enzymes don't have any energy, but they do initiate, the explosions that would take place to like drive your car, right? That's kind of how enzymes work. So your body needs to make enzymes regularly in order to do all the really cool chemistry of daily living. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to have adequate protein intake in your diet. It's not just about building muscle, although that is also a big part of it. You need to make sure that you get enough protein so that you can effectively have enough enzymes. This is one of the problems with low calorie diets. When people go on these like ultra low calorie diets, they lose out on having like certain digestive enzymes and other enzymes inside their body. And it literally does mess up their metabolism. And if they do it for a really long time, they can see effects from that for an exceptionally long period of time, like years. This is where like people who maybe struggle with disordered eating of some type got such a low protein intake along with a low just energy, low intake of everything in general, right? But what that results in is like a metabolism that moves slower than it really should. So one more reason why we definitely want to get protein and why I think protein is so freaking cool. Here's also like what's known as a nucleotide. This is going to come in your diet as well. You're just going to kind of naturally get this, but this stores like genetic information. So this is how we often get like, some of the components for like DNA and stuff. So that is the chemistry that we spend most of our time talking about. We are going to talk about proteins, fats, and carbs. Obviously, there's some other stuff going on there as well, but those are probably the biggest ones. So I know I love to ask it, but questions, comments, concerns. Any questions about proteins? Any questions about carbs? Any questions about fats, DNA, anything like that? How are y'all feeling? Checking in with you guys. Everybody's like either at work or passed out. How we doing, Dion?
I'm good.
I'm here.
Yeah.
No. Oh no, I'm not. Yeah. I'm just making sure everybody's feeling good. Okay, so we're gonna start talking about cells. Cells sometimes a little hard to visualize. So when we're talking about our cells, right, and this is going to help us understand like the various types of cells that we talk about for the rest of this course, right? We talk about muscle cells, talk about bone cells, right? Talk about neurons. So we're going to look at sort of a general cell today. Now, what's ironic about what we're going to see, if I pull up this, right, you actually don't have any cells that look like this. This one's kind of funny. This is kind of your classic like biology class cell. This is meant to be just, like this cell doesn't have any function. I remember yesterday I kept saying, form follows function, right? Well, this form is very general, so it can't really do anything, right? But it's a perfect one for sort of us highlighting how your cells are going to operate inside your body. It is got a little bit of everything, which makes it really good as a diagram to teach, even though none of your cells actually look directly like this. If you look at like in a muscle fiber, it looks like a muscle cell looks like, whoop, muscle cell. Is my internet dead? No? Okay. Why is this not working? Okay, apparently my Google's broken. I can't believe this, but I'm going to open up Microsoft Edge. So if you look at like a muscle cell, it looks like this, very different looking, right? Like you can see that is a very different shape, but everything that is found inside of a regular cell can also be found in this muscle cell. It's just got some special other stuff. Same thing is true of like, you can see red blood cells, muscle cells, neurons, right? They're all just shaped a little bit differently due to like a different assembling of protein. But today we're looking at sort of a general cell. We're just going to look at that as an example, but it'll give us a deeper understanding of stuff later on. So we're going to talk a little bit about like cell structure, what's going to be found inside of a cell. We'll talk a little bit about like how membranes work, how they're allowing certain materials in and certain materials out. And then I will briefly mention protein synthesis. We'll talk a little bit about DNA, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And then cell division, aging, and then like cancer cells. These are all very distinct things that are pretty much strictly based in the medical field. Again, that's not really our role, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these. But if you guys have a question about them, please feel free to ask. So The cell, right? So we had all these like chemicals. The chemicals came together to make up stuff, and all the stuff comes together to make up cells, right? So cells are the basic unit that we use to assemble, eventually what will come in, you get a group of cells, you end up with a tissue, you get a bunch of tissue, you get an organ, you get a bunch of organs, boom, you got a person, you know? So let's really quickly take a look at like what the outside of a cell is going to look like. So the outside of a cell is actually going to be very furry if it's an animal cell, which I love. Animal cells are furry. I think that that's great. Plant cells, they look a little bit different. They tend to have just kind of a solid wall on the outside. But animal cells, they got all these like, we call it cilia. It's all this like little fur. And that way, like, let's say you got like a slot for carbohydrates over here, but a sugar lands over here. Well, the fur can kind of, push it generally over and kind of wiggle, and it allows it to kind of move, and then it gets sucked into the carbohydrate hole. So cilia is kind of cool because like it does kind of protect the cell, it catches anything as it's like trying to get into the cell, but also, move certain materials around to wherever they need to get to go. So from the cilia on the outside, you're going to see what's called a plasma membrane. And that's that phospholipid. Oh, that's right. My Google's not working. Why is my Google not working? That is obnoxious. You're going to see this plasma membrane, okay? And a plasma membrane is really cool. It's that phospholipid bilayer. It's made up of fats and it's 2 layers wide, right? So your plasma membrane actually, oh, that's a great picture because you can see it's kind of peeled apart there. They peeled the 2 separate layers apart, but it looks like this, right? It's got all these like really cool little channels in it. So this is 2 layers of phospholipids that are able to keep, fluids from one side to another. So you'll hear when we're talking about water, well, you'll hear people say sometimes you've got your intracellular water, that's the water found inside your cells, and you've got your extracellular water, that's the water found outside of your cells. And so we use water to sort of transport materials around to get into and out of these membranes, right? Other things that we're going to see inside of a cell is we're going to see that's the outermost layer, and then on the inside we're going to see all of these what we call organelles. Okay, and organelles are like, they're like the little organs of your cell. You get your digestive system that helps you digest stuff. Well, inside your cells, you've got lysosomes, which are helping dissolve and digest stuff. You've got your brain that helping you make decisions. Well, we've got a nucleus inside the cell, and it's in charge of spitting out DNA that tells the cell what to do. You've got your energy system, which is actually all of your cells. Well, your cells have their own little mitochondria. So I got a crash course video because you guys know I love them. And it's gonna, YouTube works. And this is gonna have a little bit of info on how our cells actually work. It's got some great pictures here. This one.
Hey, Dad, who's your favorite president?
Oh my gosh, out of here. Freaking mattress commercials. Why is it mattresses are always sold on President's Day? How did that start happening? Okay, here we go.
Is an animal. This is an animal. And this is also an animal. An animal, animal, animal carcass, animal, animal, animal carcass, again, animal. The thing that all of these other things have in common is that they're made out of the same basic building block, the animal cell. Animals are made up of your run-of-the-mill eukaryotic cells, and these are called eukaryotic because they have a true kernel in the Greek, a good nucleus, and that contains the DNA and calls the shots for the rest of the cell, also containing a bunch of organelles. There's a bunch of different kinds of organelles, and they all have very specific functions, and all of this is surrounded by the cell membrane. Of course, plants are eukaryotic cells too, but they're set up a little bit differently. Of course, they have organelles that allow them to make their own food, which is super nice. We don't have those. And also, their cell membrane is actually a cell wall. It's made of cellulose. It's rigid, which is why plants can't dance. If you want to know all about plant cells, we did a whole video on it. And you could click on it here if it's online yet. It might not be. A lot of the stuff in this video is going to apply to all eukaryotic cells, which includes plants and fungi and protists. Now, rigid cell walls, that's cool and all, but one of the reasons that animals have been so successful is that their flexible membrane, in addition to allowing them the ability to dance, gives animals the flexibility to create a bunch of different cell types and organ types and tissue types that could never be possible in a plant. The cell walls that protect plants and give them structure prevent them from evolving complicated nerve structures and muscle cells that allow animals to be such a powerful force for, eating plants. Animals can move around, find shelter and food, find things to mate with, all that good stuff. In fact, the ability to move oneself around using specialized muscle tissue has been 100% trademarked by Kingdom Animalia.
What about protozoans?
Excellent point. What about protozoids? They don't have specialized muscle tissue. They move around with cilia and flagella and that kind of thing. So way back in 1665, British scientist Robert Hooke discovered cells with his kind of crude beta version microscope. He called them cells because they looked like bare Spartan monks' bedrooms with not much going on inside. Hooke was a smart guy and everything, but he could not have been more wrong about what was going on inside of a cell. There is a whole lot going on inside of a eukaryotic cell. It's more like a city than a monk's cell. In fact, let's go with that. A cell is like a city. It has defined geographical limits, a ruling government, power plants, roads, waste treatment plants, a police force, industry, all the things a booming metropolis needs to run smoothly. But this city does not have one of those hippie governments where everybody votes on stuff and talks things out at town hall meetings and crap like that. Nope. Think fascist Italy circa 1938. Think Kim Jong-un's North Korea, and you might be getting a closer idea of how eukaryotic cells do their business. Let's start out with city limits. So as you approach the city of Eukaryopolis, there's a chance that you will notice something that a traditional city never has, which is either cilia or flagella. Some eukaryotic cells have either one or the other of these structures, cilia being a bunch of tiny little arms that wiggle around, and flagella being one long whip-like tail. Some cells have neither. Sperm cells, for instance, have flagella and our lungs, and throat cells have cilia that push mucus up and out of our lungs. Cilia and flagella are made out of long protein fibers called microtubules, and they both have the same basic structure. 9 pairs of microtubules forming a ring around 2 central microtubules. This is often called the 9+2 structure. Anyway, that's just so you know, when you're approaching the city, watch out for the cilia and flagella. If you make it past the cilia, you will encounter what is called a cell membrane, which is a kind of squishy, not rigid plant cell wall, which totally encloses the city and all of its contents. It's also in charge of monitoring what comes in and out of the cell, kind of like the fascist border police. The cell membrane has selective permeability, meaning that it can choose what molecules come in and out of the cells for the most part. And I did an entire video on this, which you can check out right here. Now, the landscape of Eukaryopolis, important to note, is kind of wet and squishy. It's a bit of a swampland. Each eukaryotic cell is filled with a solution of water and nutrients called cytoplasm. And inside of this cytoplasm is a scaffolding called the cytoskeleton. It's basically just a bunch of protein strands that reinforce the cell. Centrosomes are a special part of this reinforcement. They assemble long microtubules out of proteins that act like steel girders that hold all the city's buildings together. The cytoplasm provides the infrastructure necessary for all the organelles to do all of their awesome, amazing business, with the notable exception of the nucleus, which has its own kind of cytoplasm called the nucleoplasm, which is a more luxurious, premium environment befitting the cell's beloved leader. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about the cell's highway system. The endoplasmic reticulum, or just ER, are organelles that create a network of membranes that carry stuff around the cell. These membranes are phospholipid bilayers, same as in the cell membrane. There are 2 types of ER. There's the rough and the smooth. Fairly similar, but slightly different shapes, slightly different functions. The rough ER looks all bumpy because it has ribosomes attached to it, and the smooth ER doesn't, so it's a smooth network of tubes. Smooth ER acts as a kind of factory warehouse in the cell city. It contains enzymes that help with the creation of important lipids, which you'll recall from our talk about biological molecules, phospholipids and steroids that turn out to be sex hormones. Other enzymes in the smooth ER specialize in detoxifying substance, like noxious stuff derived from drugs and alcohol, which they do by adding a carboxyl group to them, making them soluble in water. Finally, the smooth ER also stores ions in solutions that the cell may need later on, especially sodium ions, which are used for energy in muscle cells. So the smooth ER helps make lipids, while the rough ER helps in the synthesis and packaging of proteins. And those proteins are created by another type of organelle, the ribosome. Ribosomes can float freely throughout the cytoplasm or be attached to the nuclear envelope, which is where they're spat out from. And their job is to assemble amino acids into polypeptides. As the ribosome builds an amino acid chain, the chain is pushed into the ER. When the protein chain is complete, the ER pinches it off and sends it to the Golgi apparatus. And the city that is the cell, the Golgi is the post office, processing proteins and packaging them up before sending them wherever they need to go. Calling it an apparatus makes it sound like a bit of complicated machinery, which it kind of is because it's made up of like these stacks of membranous layers that are sometimes called Golgi Bodies. The Golgi bodies can cut up large proteins into smaller hormones and can combine proteins with carbohydrates to make various molecules, like for instance, snot. The bodies package these little goodies into sacs called vesicles, which have phospholipid walls just like the main cell membrane, then ship them out either to other parts of the cell or outside the cell wall. We learn more about how vesicles do this in the next episode of Crash Course.
The Golgi bodies also put the finishing touches on the lysosomes. Lysosomes are basically the waste treatment plants and recycling centers of the city. These organelles are basically sacs full of enzymes that break down cellular waste and debris from outside of the cell and turn it into simple compounds which are transferred into the cytoplasm as new cell-building materials.
Now, finally, let us talk about the nucleus, the beloved leader. The nucleus is a highly specialized organelle that lives in its own double-membraned, high-security compound with its buddy, the nucleolus. And within the cell, the nucleus is in charge in a major way. Because it stores the cell's DNA, it has all the information the cell needs to do its job. So the nucleus makes all the laws for the city and orders all the other organelles around, telling them how and when to grow, what to metabolize, what proteins to synthesize, how and when to divide. The nucleus does all this by using the information blueprinted in its DNA to build proteins that will facilitate a specific job getting done. For instance, on January 1st, 2012, let's say a liver cell needs to help break down an entire bottle of champagne. The nucleus in that liver cell would start telling the cell to make alcohol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that makes alcohol not alcohol anymore. This protein synthesis business is complicated. Lucky for you, we will have, or may already have, an entire video about how it happens. The nucleus holds its precious DNA along with some proteins in a web-like substance called a chromatin. When it comes time for the cell to split, the chromatin gathers into rod-shaped chromosomes, each of which holds DNA molecules. Different species of animals have different numbers of chromosomes. We humans have 46, fruit flies have 8. Hedgehogs, which are adorable, but less complex than humans, have 90. Now the nucleolus, which lives inside of the nucleus, is the only organelle not enveloped by its own membrane. It's just a gooey splotch of stuff within the nucleus. Its main job is creating ribosomal RNA, or rRNA, which it then combines with some proteins to form the basic units of ribosomes. Once these units are done, the nucleolus spits them out of the nuclear envelope where they are fully assembled into ribosomes. The nucleus then sends orders in the form of messenger RNA, or mRNA, to those ribosomes, which are the henchmen that carry out the orders in the rest of the cell. How exactly the ribosomes do this is immensely complex and awesome. So awesome, in fact, that we're going to give it the full crash course treatment, an entire episode. And now for what is, totally objectively speaking, of course, the coolest part of the animal cell. Its power plants, the mitochondria, the smooth, oblong organelles where the amazing and super important process of respiration takes place. This is where energy is derived from carbohydrates, fats, and other fuels and is converted into adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is like the main currency that drives life in Eukaryopolis. You can learn more about ATP and respiration in an episode that we did on that. Now, of course, some cells, like muscle cells or neuron cells, need a lot more power than the average cell in the body, and so those cells have a lot more mitochondria per cell. But maybe the coolest thing about mitochondria is that long ago, animal cells didn't have them, but they existed as their own sort of bacterial cell. And one day, one of these things ended up inside of an animal cell, probably because the animal cell was trying to eat it. But instead of eating it, it realized that this thing was really super smart and good at turning food into energy, and it just kept it. it stayed around. And to this day, they sort of act like their own separate organisms, like they do their own thing within the cell, they replicate themselves, they even contain a small amount of DNA. Now, what may be even more awesome, if that's possible, is that mitochondria are in the egg cell when an egg gets fertilized. And those mitochondria have DNA. But because mitochondria replicate themselves in a separate fashion, it doesn't get mixed with the DNA of the father. It's just the mother's mitochondrial DNA. That means that your and my mitochondrial DNA is exactly the same as the mitochondrial DNA of our mothers. And because this special DNA is isolated in this way, scientists can actually track back and back and back and back to a single mitochondrial Eve who lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. All of that complication and mystery and beauty in one of the cells of your body. It's complicated, yes, but worth understanding. Review time! Another somewhat complicated episode of Crash Course Biology. If you want to go back and watch any of the stuff that we talked about it to reinforce it in your brain, if you didn't quite get it, just click on the links and it'll take you back in time to when I was talking about that mere minutes ago. Thank you for watching. If you have questions.
Okay, so love that video because it's a really good, you can kind of see how all those individual pieces are sort of working. And I love the analogy of like a city for a cell, you know? So like I said, we're going to see the plasma membrane around the outside. You know, it is a bilayer. It's a phospholipid bilayer, 2 layers that are able to keep certain materials in or out of the cell. You've got the nucleus, which is usually the largest organelle inside, is where you get all your DNA. Right. What's really fun about like muscle cells, for instance, is like they have a lot of nuclei inside of them. Right. You know, you'll see a lot of little nucleuses inside of a muscle cell. This is what makes muscle cells actually so good at growing. Because like basically what's really kind of fascinating here is that those DNAs, those nucleuses can actually like become, you know, what we call progenitor cells, which become new muscle tissue later on. It's part of the way that like our muscles grow and stuff. So that's our nucleus there. We've got cytoplasm. You can see here, I love this, like cytosol is the fluid itself. We don't really, you know, ever have just cytosol inside of a cell, but the fluid is called the sol. And then when it's got stuff in it, which, you know, it always does, we call it cytoplasm. So you'll often hear that, you know, all by itself, but cytoplasm is the fluid that has all the organelles are sort of suspended in the same way that, like, you know, chocolate particles are suspended in chocolate milk. So then all the individual organelles. Now there's a lot of them, right? They're all doing their own little things. But the big one we're going to talk about for now is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is responsible for the energy production, right? I know every high school biology teacher has said this for 1,000 years, but it's the powerhouse of the cell, you know, like it is literally where you are generating all of your energy. So, you know, those of you who just got through our nutrition class, we know that glucose and carbohydrates go into the mitochondria, and then it is going to use the byproducts of that to spit out a whole bunch of ATP, and ATP is actually like our energy, right? So our mitochondria take in glucose and they take in a whole bunch of oxygen and they spit out energy, and we use that energy to do all of our work and stuff. And then the coolest thing that I got to say is that a cell's shape will always relate to its function. So again, when we look at cells, they've got all kinds of really cool different shapes out there, and they can all do very different things, right? Probably the coolest type of cell in your body is what we're seeing here. It's called a stem cell, and that's a cell that can kind of shape itself in a bunch of different ways. We got bone cells, which form themselves. You know, this looks kind of interesting, but it's actually very flat, and that allows you to stack a whole bunch of them on top of each other, and that's why bone cells are so dense and hard and resistant to damage. You got fat cells, which fat cells are actually, even earlier I said like your cells never look like they do in that picture. Fat cells actually do kind of look like that in this section, but then they have this big empty sac here, and that's where we actually store triglycerides and fats, you know, to be used for energy later. We got muscle cells, we got sex cells, we got immune cells, nervous system cells. Epithelial cells are your skin cells. Those are kind of fun because they're very stretchy. They got extra collagen in them. So they all look just like a little bit different from one another, right? And the reason why is because they need to have different functions. So that's what we're going to be talking about as we move through the muscular system, the nervous system, the skeletal system. We'll be looking at like the different shapes there. So what's really cool about your plasma membrane in particular, the outside membrane of the cell, I keep saying that it's a bilayer, it's a double layer, right? It keeps certain things out, it keeps certain things in, it encloses the outside, kind of like your skin is keeping all the you stuff inside, right? So it encloses the cell's content and allows it to either grow in specific ways or interact with other things. For instance, like you'll see like certain neurons can interact with one another, right? Like you'll see like one neuron will attach to another neuron, will attach to another neuron until eventually, it's coming all the way from your brain to wherever it happens to be going. Well, the outside membranes of those cells are actually interacting using like little chemicals. And so like on the outside of like on the, tail end of one neuron, it'll spit out chemicals, and on the receiving side of another neuron, it'll accept those chemicals, and that's what tells it to do the next, thought or action, right? So a lot of really cool things that we're going to see on the outside of our cell structure. We're going to see channels, which are like little pores that allow things to come in from one side to another. We'll see transporters, which are actually like little shuttles that kind of wait at the cell membrane, and then when it wants to get something in, it'll just kind of carry it from one side to the other. We're going to see receptors, which are actually, like I just described, like you got a spitting chemical end and you got a receiving end. That's the receiving end. You've got enzymes that are out there to like, wait around, and then whenever a chemical reaction needs to take place, they kick in. Linkers, which attach them. And then probably most importantly, you've got like cell identity markers, which are basically the name tags that say, hey, I'm a Cyrus cell, or hey, I'm a Julio cell, that is how your immune system knows to be like, some virus or some bacteria gets into your bloodstream and your body's like, show me your ID card. It's like, yeah, like sadly, Dion, right now you're dealing with this directly, like right now. But like you got a virus running around your body, your immune system's fighting it off, which is making you feel probably achy and tired and all that stuff, because your body is using a lot of energy to kind of fight off some type of virus, right? The way that your body knew to start doing that is because it was, it's like a bouncer at a club, like, hey, like, show me your invitation. And then it's like, oh my God, it's the corona. Like, and then your immune system starts fighting it off. So we do have cell identity markers. This is where, like, for instance, things like blood types come from, that's also an identity marker situation. It's not exactly the same, but kind of similar. So your membrane is really cool. And one of the reasons why it's so cool is because it does allow certain materials in and certain materials out. One of the most important materials that it allows in and out are what are known as your electrolytes, okay? So electrolytes are, going back to our last lesson on chemistry, they're minerals, sodium, potassium, a little bit of chlorine, right? Even magnesium can act as an electrolyte, right? So these electrolytes are actually little metals inside your body, and they have a difference in electric charge, okay? So because your cell membrane is what we call selectively permeable, it can let certain things in and set certain things out, it can push sodium and potassium into different sections here. Now, if you look at sodium and potassium, you'll notice there's like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 potassium ions over here and 2 sodiums. And over here we got 1, 2, 3 potassiums and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 5 sodium ions. So sodium is a highly positively charged ion, right? And potassium is also positively charged, but it's less positively charged. So because of that, there's a difference in charge here. You've got a negative end on one side of the cell, and you got a positive end on the other. Now, one of the really cool things that your body can do is it can push sodium from one side to the other. and it can push potassium in the opposite direction. And what ends up happening with that, and it does this through what we call the sodium potassium pump. What it does, and what's so cool about this, is that it changes the charge. It changes suddenly, like one part of your cell is now negative and the other part is now positive, and it used to be the other way around. Sodium potassium pump. Come on, give me what I want. That is it. Let's see if it's, oh, good. So you'll notice that like we've got all the positive stuff over here. These are all the plus signs over here, all the negative stuff over here. So what happens is channels open up and your body will push certain materials from one place to another. And so when that happens, now the charge is backwards, right? So now we've got positive over here and negative over here. This is exactly like a little battery in your remote control, right? So you know how you've got like, you know, you got two ends to a battery, right? You got the positive end, you get the negative end, right? If you took both of them and you put both batteries in the same way, your remote's not going to work because there's no reason for the electrons in that battery to move back and forth. So you take one of them and you flip it, and now you've got like positive here, negative here, positive here, right? Now it's able to generate electricity, right? The electrons are moving and your remote control captures that electricity and uses it to send a signal to your TV, right? That's what happens in your body. So when we look at like an action potential traveling down a neuron, your neurons are going to do this much more often than pretty much any other type of cell out there. It's going to look like this. So you can see like the positive and the negative are kind of flipping spots, and then it happens and it travels down, and it travels down further and further, right? It's going to go from here to here, and it's going to go from here to here. This GIF keeps resetting, but it's going to travel down the tail of the neuron thanks to moving sodium and potassium, right? There's the charge traveling from one spot to the other. So we need to have these inorganic elements, these metals inside of our body, and then we need our cells to move those metals in different concentrations in order to make electric signals. And that's how our brain communicates with our muscle system, right? Let's see, action potential, neuromuscular junction. So like a neuron will zap a muscle fiber. If I can find the right GIF, there we go. And it'll look like this. Oh, it's not animated. Well, all right, so this electric signal will travel down, and then it will run across the muscle cell and trigger an action potential in the muscle cell. And then the muscle cell will then contract. And that's why we do that. That's why we need sodium and potassium. We need to make sure we have those electrolytes. So if you've ever been cramping up, people will tell you, oh, you need to eat a banana, right? Because like bananas are filled with potassium, and potassium is one of our electrolytes. So that is the sort of selective permeable membrane that we're talking about here, right? It allows certain materials to move from one spot to another. Now, why does it actually move that way? Well, we'll talk about that in just 1 second. But finishing up, look, that's the membrane. Finishing up talking about like what organelles are present in your cell. You got the nucleus, which has all the DNA. It tells the cell what to do. You get the cytoplasm, which is all the fluid. This has got those electrolytes sitting there waiting to get flushed into whatever direction. You know, let's say you've got some, again, we're looking at this, right? This is the intracellular fluid. This is inside the cell. This is the extracellular fluid. This is outside the cell. You've got these electrolytes just sitting here. Potassium is waiting to get flushed to this side, so you can create that action potential. And then there's a bunch of other ones, but honestly, you don't need to know too much about every single freaking organelle. The ones that are important are the nucleus and the mitochondria and the cell's membrane and the fluid within that cell. Now, like I said, a cell shape is going to be related to its function, so it can do all kinds of fun stuff. You know, red blood cells, for instance, they actually don't have their organelles anymore. You look at like the life cycle of a red blood cell. This is kind of fascinating, actually. Your red blood cells are kind of cool. When they're made by your bones, they actually look like this. They're what's called a hemopoietic cell. They're not fully what we call an erythrocyte just yet. And so what'll happen is they'll kind of go through this whole life cycle here. And then right at the very end, they'll do what's called enucleation. Basically, your red blood cells, when they're ready to go, they spit out all of their organs. They go bleh, and they spit them out. And so your red blood cell, come on, show me the organelle change. Well, they end up looking like this. They kind of collapse in on themselves. And that's why they kind of look like a filled in donut. They used to be a big circle, right? But now it's kind of like a deflated basketball. That's what happens when it spits out all of its organelles. And it needs to do that because your red blood cells actually need to be able to fold and squeeze through little blood vessels, right? So it's amazing, right? Like that's one of the really cool little things. So we got a lot of different cells that have a lot of different shapes, you know? Like I said, your neurons are really good at moving sodium and potassium. They use electricity probably more than any other cell in your body. Your brain is mostly electrochemical activity. So lots of them. There's neurons, and then also they got all these little fingers that allows neurons to attach to one another. Epithelial cells, there's your skin cells. They're really stretchy. Muscle cells have contractile proteins. Blood cells can squeeze. And then like sperm cells, they're like a torpedo. You know, they've got one job, and that is to puncture an egg. So that is the sort of shape of our cells. Now, last thing I want to talk about before I let you guys go today, just talking about this idea of selective permeability. We've been talking about like moving materials around, so we kind of want to understand how that works. So we're going to talk really briefly about diffusion, right? So diffusion is where a material like a solute, right, will travel down a concentration gradient. So I mentioned yesterday, if you want to understand a little bit of how the universe works, right, just remember that form follows function. Stuff is shaped a certain way because it has to act a certain way, right? Form follows function. Great, cool. You'll understand the universe a little bit better if we keep that in mind. I got one more rule for you. You want to understand the universe just a little bit better, remember this. Nature hates gradients. I know that like a lot of you guys have heard me say this plenty of times, but I always try to remind everyone, nature does not like a gradient. What I mean by that is like, not making any political statements here, but like nature's kind of a socialist. It does not like there to be a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here. It likes it to be even, right? So what will happen is if you have a lot of stuff over here and you don't have very much stuff over here, it will move it from here until it's nice and even on both sides. So nature hates a triangle. You know, if you think about like, this is a gradient, right? And what I mean by that is like, you know, there's a lot of stuff over here, and then there's very little stuff over here. So what's going to happen is nature is going to move stuff this way until eventually it looks more like this, right? That is sort of what we're going for here. So now let's say we put like a little membrane in the middle of this, right? Let's say we put like a little dividing membrane, right? But it's selectively permeable like your cells, right? It can let certain materials in and certain materials out. Well, then if I have a lot of materials over here, right? Like let's say I've got just a bunch of stuff over here of very high concentration, right? Now there's just a lot of it, right? All those little green particles, there's tons of them, right? Whereas on the other side, I've only got like 4 or 5. What is going to happen naturally is nature will actually push through this wall and move it over here until the concentration of all of them, is equal, right? And now the concentration, even with that wall, is going to be the same on both sides, right? So it might be, you know, something that looks a little bit more like this. And now the concentration's equal on both sides. Nature's happy, right? That process of moving that is diffusion, right? This is like me. If you put me in like a crowd, I don't love crowds. So like, I'm probably just gonna be like, there's a lot of people here, and I'm going to naturally move away. I'm going to work my way to the door where I can breathe a little bit better. I'm going to diffuse away from the crowd. Salt, sodium, potassium, right? Those things are going to move away from where the concentration is. That's why potassium moved this way, because there was very little potassium. That's why sodium moved this way, because there was very little sodium. So something passively moves, that's diffusion. Now, there is special types of this. There's facilitated diffusion, where a transporter might carry something. That way it can actually go against its concentration gradient. There's osmosis, which is basically diffusion when we're talking about water. So water moving from high areas to low areas. This is where, like, if you've ever taken like a slice of bread and dropped it into water, it'll sit there for a moment, right? But then eventually all the water starts rushing into the bread, because there's a high concentration of water in, let's say, the Tupperware that you're using to do this experiment in, and there's very low concentration of water inside the bread. So what'll happen is the water will rush in there until the concentration on both sides is equal. So that's osmosis. Filtration is another one. Filtration is where there's actually a mechanical force pushing. Actually, there's pictures of all this. So here's diffusion, right? We dropped maybe a chunk of salt, and then that salt is naturally spreading itself evenly throughout the water, or sugar or something like that, right? There's facilitated diffusion, where we're actually pushing things against the concentration gradient. Eventually there ends up being a lot of sodium or a lot of potassium on one side. Nature doesn't like that. And so then your body pushes harder to make sure that it continues happening. There's filtration, water osmosis first. So here's osmosis, right? Now this is kind of a fun one. You can actually see this looks like there's the same amount of water on both sides, but there's actually less water on this side because there's a bunch of salt particles taking up space. So there's actually a lower concentration of water. There's less water over here than there is over here. So let's say this is salt water and this is regular water, and you've got a membrane in between. What'll happen is the water will move from the freshwater side to the saltwater side until the concentration of pure water on both sides is equal. This is exactly why they tell you, if you're ever like, stranded on a desert island or something, do not drink salt water. It may make you less thirsty in the short term, but it will dehydrate your cells. And what will happen is all of your cells will donate their water to push apart the salt water outside of your cells. And this will all get dehydrated, and that's why you end up running into problems. This is also why they say coffee dehydrates you, because you're drinking water, but it has particles of other stuff in it, right? So that's a little bit of osmosis there. There's also filtration, where a mechanical force can actually sort of push against that concentration to maybe move it back in the other direction. You've probably experienced this if you've ever sort of like tried to shove something through and it kind of goes at the pace it goes at. Doesn't matter how hard you press, it doesn't make it happen any faster sometimes. So if you have like what we call like a hypertonic solution, that's a solution that has a really high concentration. It's hyper means a lot of, right? It has a really high concentration. So salt water is hypertonic compared to fresh water. So if you have like a hypertonic solution on one side and a hypotonic solution with a low concentration over here, the low concentration stuff will naturally move that way. This is why salt water will dehydrate you. So if this was a red blood cell here on the left, and this is just the water, your extracellular fluid, which is now salt water, what will happen is your cells will donate their water, and it'll look like this. Your cell, if you drop a red blood cell in salt water, all of the water inside that red blood cell will get sucked out of it naturally due to osmosis. And so it'll try to push all these salt particles away from each other. And exactly the opposite is true as well. Your cells, your red blood cells have like, stuff inside of them, right? Electrolytes and other things. So if you were to drop a red blood cell in pure water, like fresh water, then fresh water would actually have a lower concentration. It would be hypotonic. So then all the water would rush into the cell and actually cause the cell to probably explode. Whereas like isotonic is neutral. Okay, isotonic is the exact same amount. So ideally, we want to be hydrated enough to have isotonic water. We get overly hydrated, we start to end up hypotonic. If we get dehydrated, we start to end up like hypertonic, and that's dangerous. You know, it's not, our cells can't function that way. And that's why we talked about cells today, right? Like I know that like sometimes when you're on your journey to like personal training, you're like, what is this like biology stuff? How does this translate to lifting weights? But it's like, look, when you lose water, you are going to lose performance. You know, your muscles will not be able to function properly if they are not hydrated. So we need to make sure that we like stay hydrated. And so like this is where drinking lots of water can really help with that. And then we also know that we need carbohydrates to produce energy. Well, what if we got a bunch of water plus a bunch of carbohydrates simultaneously, right? Great. Well, then that's going to be like where orange juice or something like that comes along, which is why they give orange slices out at like marathons and stuff, right? Well, now let's look at another requirement we have. What about the sodium and potassium, which helps us keep from cramping, right? It makes our muscles contract, right? It's how our body communicates, is using electric charges, right? So sodium and potassium. Well, now why don't we make a drink that has like plenty of water in it, plenty of carbohydrates in it to give us energy, and then let's put some sodium and potassium in there as well. Oh my God, we just invented Gatorade. So that is, sort of the idea there. Now I will say, Gatorade actually can be fine if you are an athlete in the middle of a super intense event. But drinking it while you're sitting on the couch watching TV doesn't mean it's not doing you any good. It's just sugar water at that point. So last little bit talking about moving stuff around. We saw all of those examples, right? Moving the sort of different filtrations. Your cells are also going to have their own sort of metabolism for getting rid of stuff and getting and eating stuff, right? You've got what is called phagocytosis, which is where like a particle will come in, your cell wall will pinch itself off, and then it will basically dissolve that material. That's how your cells digest stuff. So like a particle hits the outside of the cell wraps itself around and then, pinches it off and starts eating it. You've also got exocytosis, which is exactly the opposite, where, any extra materials your cell wants to get rid of goes to the membrane and then the membrane spits that out. Earlier, we were talking about like, one neuron sort of spitting out chemicals and the other neuron accepting it. That's exocytosis. It's like, bleh, spits it out. So those are your various cell membranes and how they work. I know that is going to be a lot, but we are going to need that information when we get into muscle cells, I believe tomorrow, right? Day 3 is muscles. Yeah, we get into the skeletal system and the muscular system tomorrow. So we'll zoom out a little bit, which is going to be nice. And we're going to talk about muscles and bones and their anatomic structures and how they function physiologically. But for today, that is about it. Any questions, guys? How we all feeling? Pretty good?
Good.
Love that. All righty, let me kill the recording here, and I'll let you guys out here. Danny, Cyrus, I'm going to keep you for just a moment. I do want to show you the homework stuff.